Between 1880 and 1900, roughly 800,000 elephants were killed across Africa. Not for food, not for survival, mostly for piano keys, for people who would never set foot on the continent in their lives. Picture a parlor in London, or Boston, or Vienna. A woman sits down at a piano after dinner. Her fingers rest on keys so smooth and so white they seem almost to glow under gaslight. She plays a few bars of something fashionable. She does not think about where the keys came from. She has no reason to. The material in front of her has already been stripped of its origin, polished, cut and sold as pure luxury, with no trace of the forest it was taken from, or the men who carried it 1,000 miles on their backs to get there. That disconnect between the object and its cost is the entire story of ivory. By the end of the 19th century, ivory was one of the most valuable commodities on earth. It built fortunes in Zanzibar, financed private armies in the Congo, and filled the parlors of the European middle class with an object so ordinary it barely registered as a luxury at all. And the price was paid almost entirely somewhere else, by people who would never sit at that piano. But the story of ivory does not start in a Victorian parlor. It does not even start with elephants. It starts tens of thousands of years earlier, carved by hands that had never seen Africa, from the tusks of an animal that had already gone extinct. Ivory looks like a footnote in history, a decorative material, a symbol of old world wealth, something confined to museum cases and antique shops. But for most of human history, ivory was not decoration. It was currency, diplomacy, and industrial infrastructure all at once. It moved empires. It built and broke trade routes across 3 continents. It is one of the few materials that can be traced in an almost unbroken line from prehistoric ritual to 19th century industry to a black market that still operates today. To understand ivory is to understand how ordinary desire, multiplied by distance and scale, can quietly reshape an entire continent. Long before ivory meant Africa, it meant something colder. Around 40,000 years ago, in what is now southern Germany, humans were already carving small figures from tusk. Not elephant tusk, mammoth. Woolly mammoths ranged across Ice Age Europe and Asia in enormous numbers, and their tusks, curved and dense, were among the largest workable materials available to prehistoric craftsmen. Archaeologists have recovered carved mammoth ivory figurines, animals, human forms, even what may be some of the earliest known musical instruments from sites across the region. This was not casual craft. Ivory took skill, time, and tools to shape, and the objects made from it were not tools of survival. They were symbolic. Ritual, status, long before anyone had a word for luxury, humans had already decided that this particular material deserved special treatment. Mammoths eventually vanished. But the appetite for ivory did not vanish with them. As mammoth populations collapsed at the end of the Ice Age, the material's source simply shifted, to walrus tusk in the far north, to hippopotamus tooth in parts of Africa, and eventually, as trade networks stretched further south, to the animal that would come to define ivory for the next several thousand years: the elephant. For thousands of years, that was the extent of ivory's reach: small, scattered, prized by whoever happened to live near a source of it. That was about to change. By the time of the early river civilizations, ivory had stopped being a local curiosity and started becoming something closer to a commodity. In ancient Egypt, ivory was carved into combs, boxes, furniture inlay, and ceremonial objects for the elite. It appears in tomb paintings and trade records as something brought in from further south, a material valuable enough to be worth transporting long distances, and rare enough to signal power the moment it appeared in a household. The Phoenicians, master traders of the ancient Mediterranean, understood something crucial about ivory that would define its future for millennia. It was extraordinarily good at moving. A single tusk was compact relative to its value, easy to carry by ship or caravan, and did not spoil. It could be carved anywhere by anyone with the skill, which meant the raw material and the finished luxury good did not have to come from the same place at all. Ivory could be hunted in one region, shipped through a second, and carved into a throne or a game piece in a third, with the profit distributed across every stop along the way. This is the moment ivory stops being a prehistoric ritual object and becomes something closer to a proto-global commodity.
We have 3 ships
It had
arriving
weight,
by sundown.
it had status,
We must clear this
and
section.
critically,
The
it
shipment
had a
for the king
supply
must be
chain.
prioritized.
Once a material has all 3, history tends to notice. What happened next changed everything. Not because ivory became more valuable, but because one empire decided
20
it wanted
shekels for
an
the crate,
almost
as agreed.
limitless
A
supply
pleasure
of it.
doing business with you.
Rome did not invent the ivory trade,
Get these
but Rome may have been the first civilization to industrialize it and to demonstrate centuries before anyone had the vocabulary for it what unsustainable demand actually does to a wild population. Elite Roman households used ivory for furniture, religious statuary, and decorative inlay on an enormous scale. Ivory thrones and ceremonial chairs signaled the highest tiers of political power. But the real driver of large-scale consumption was spectacle. The Roman arena required elephants for combat displays, for executions, for sheer scale of entertainment, and elephants captured or killed for the arena fed directly into a secondary supply of ivory once the spectacle was over. By some accounts, this demand contributed to the extinction or near extinction of the North African elephant population within a few centuries, a population that had existed in the region for millennia before Roman expansion. Historians debate the exact pace and cause, since climate shifts and habitat pressure likely played a role alongside hunting. But the pattern that emerges from the evidence is unmistakable. And it is a pattern that will repeat almost exactly in 19th century East Africa. A wealthy, distant population creates demand. A supply chain forms to meet it, and the animal at the source of that supply chain pays a price its consumers never see. Rome eventually exhausted its nearest ivory source and had to reach further south for more. It would not be the last empire to do so. If Rome established the pattern, the 19th century East African ivory trade perfected it and revealed its darkest mechanism. By the 1700s and 1800s, the island of Zanzibar, off the coast of what is now Tanzania, had become the central marketplace for ivory flowing out of the African interior. Merchant caravans pushed hundreds of miles inland into regions far beyond the coast in search of elephant populations that had not yet been depleted. But moving a tusk that could weigh over 100 pounds across hundreds of miles of terrain required labor, enormous amounts of it. And that labor was met catastrophically by the East African slave trade. The ivory trade and the human trafficking trade were not separate systems running in parallel. By many historical accounts, they were the same system. Enslaved people were forced to carry tusks on the long march to the coast, and upon arrival, some historians note that the ivory itself was frequently valued above the porters who had carried it, the human cargo becoming, in effect, a secondary commodity to the primary one strapped to their backs. This is
they
a claim
marched
documented in
bound
multiple
together,
first-hand
the ivory
accounts
heavy
from the
on their
period,
backs.
though the
Few
exact
survived
scale
the
and
journey to the
proportions
coast.
are still debated among historians, and it should not be flattened into a single tidy statistic. What is
These
not in
tusks are
dispute
magnificent.
is that the two
A fair
trades
price
were
for the
deeply
finest ivory.
mechanically
Indeed, Sultan.
intertwined,
We agree on
and
the
that the
price. May your
profits
wealth
from both
increase.
flowed toward the
so
same
they
merchants,
marched them,
sultanates,
bound together,
and
the
eventually
ivory heavy on
European
their
trading
backs.
interests.
Few survived.
This system did not stay confined to East Africa's coast. As
The northern
European
boundary will
colonial
follow this
powers
parallel
began
exactly.
carving up the
It secures
continent
the
later
mining
in the
concessions.
century,
Very good.
the administrative
Now,
and
where shall we
economic
divert the
infrastructure
river?
built to extract ivory, the forced labor, the inland supply routes, the treatment of both material and people as extractable resources became a template. Nowhere
faster.
would that
Load
template
the
be
rubber
applied
onto the
with more
carts.
devastating
We have a quota to
consequence
meet.
than in the Congo, where the ivory trade would soon give way
Keep
to
the
an
pace
even
steady.
more
Move
infamous
along
extraction economy: rubber. But
Get those
before that
tusks to the
turn,
cutters now.
ivory
We must
still
double
had one
production
more
before the next
transformation
shipment.
ahead of it, the one that would turn a luxury good into a
600
mass
going once,
market
going
obsession,
twice. Sold
and
to the
push
gentleman in the
elephant
silk.
populations
Come
toward
now, more
collapse
ivory
on an
here,
industrial
best price.
scale. For most of history, ivory had been rare enough that only the powerful could afford it. In the 19th century, that changed, and it changed because of a piano. The rise of industrial manufacturing across Europe and America turned ivory from an elite curiosity into a mass market material almost overnight. Piano keys were the single largest driver. A growing middle class wanted pianos in their parlors as a marker of respectability.
600 going once,
And nearly
going
every
twice.
piano
Sold
made
to
in
the
this
gentleman in
era
the silk.
was finished with
Come
thin
now, more
veneers of
ivory
polished
here, best
ivory
price.
across its keys. But pianos were only the beginning. Ivory was cut into billiard balls, carved into cutlery handles, molded into corset busks, fashioned into hairbrush
These
backs
tusks are
and
magnificent.
hand mirrors and
A fair price
dice
for the
and
finest ivory.
dominoes.
Indeed, Sultan.
It became, for the first time, an everyday object. Something a comfortably middle-class household could simply own, rather than something reserved for royalty. That shift in scale is the entire story. A single elite household buying an ivory throne once a generation places almost no pressure on an elephant population. A rapidly industrializing middle class across two continents, all wanting a piano, applies a kind of pressure the species had never faced before. The demand pulled ivory traders and hunters deeper and deeper into the African interior, following the same brutal logistics established in the Zanzibar trade, because the animals near established routes had already been hunted out. Estimates for elephants killed during the peak decades of this boom run into the hundreds of thousands. And while historians differ on the precise figures, the direction of the trend is not in dispute. Populations that had sustained hunting for centuries were now collapsing within a single human lifetime. That sounds absurd now, that a woman's evening piano recital and the collapse of an elephant population on another continent were, quite literally, the same event, separated only by distance and a very long, very brutal supply chain. But that was the mechanism. Comfort here, extraction there, and almost nobody in the middle able or willing to connect the two. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. There's a lot more like this coming. By the middle of the 20th century, the mathematics of the ivory trade
Decades
had
of
become
extensive
impossible
ivory have
to
reduced
ignore.
these magnificent-
Elephant populations that had once numbered in the millions across Africa had been reduced to a fraction of that number, and the pace of decline was accelerating, not slowing. Poaching, now often organized and heavily armed, was outstripping any natural population recovery. In 1989, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, enacted a near-total international ban on the commercial ivory trade. It was, by most measures, a turning point. Prices for raw ivory in several key markets fell sharply within a few years, and some elephant populations began to show early signs of recovery in regions where enforcement was strong. But a legal ban does not erase demand, it simply pushes it underground. A black market in ivory persisted, and by some estimates has periodically resurged, fed by continued demand in a handful of markets and organized poaching networks sophisticated enough to launder illegal ivory through loopholes in domestic pre-ban ivory sales. Conservation organizations and researchers have linked significant poaching operations to organized criminal networks, some of which reportedly use ivory profits to help fund other illicit activity, though the exact scale of these financial links is difficult to verify and remains an area of ongoing investigation rather than settled fact. The story does not end in triumph. It ends in an uneasy standoff, bans that mostly work, markets that partly persist, and a species still being weighed, in some corners of the world, against the price of a carving. Ivory's modern story is, in a strange way, a story about substitution. As legal ivory became harder to obtain and increasingly stigmatized, manufacturers who once relied on it, piano makers in particular, spent much of the 20th century developing synthetic alternatives. Plastic and other composite materials now cover the keys of nearly every piano made, engineered specifically to mimic the texture ivory once provided. In a sense, the material that once defined middle-class comfort has been almost entirely replaced by an artificial imitation of itself, so effective that most people playing a piano today have never touched real ivory and would not know the difference if they had.
Decades
And
of the
yet
peaceful moment
elephants
is
remain
broken.
under threat.
The matriarch knows the sound
Poaching
of the drone
has
means
not
danger is
disappeared,
near,
it has
forcing the
adapted,
herd to retreat
following new
once more.
markets and new
Your manifest
smuggling
says
routes,
spare parts, but I
even
see
as
something
international law and public sentiment
I swear,
have turned
madam, I
firmly
know
against
nothing
the
about
trade. Some populations are recovering. Others, particularly in regions with weaker enforcement or ongoing conflict, remain fragile. The story of ivory has not resolved into a clean ending. It has simply moved into a new, quieter phase, still being written in real time by conservationists, poachers, and governments alike. Ivory was never really about elephants, not to the people who wanted it. It was about distance, about how easily a material could travel from a forest that most of its buyers would never see, through a supply chain that most of its buyers never thought about, and into a parlor, a piano, a chess set, a hairbrush, where it simply became beautiful. That is what made it so dangerous. Not cruelty, exactly. Indifference at industrial scale, made possible by the sheer number of hands and miles standing between the object and its origin.
Copy that.
The pattern is not unique to ivory. It is the pattern behind sugar, rubber, cotton, and a dozen other ordinary materials that quietly reorganized the world to satisfy a comfort nobody thought too hard about. But ivory may be the clearest version of it, because the cost was never hidden in fine print or buried in a factory. It was carved directly into the object itself, polished, smoothed, and sold as pure luxury, with every trace of where it came from deliberately removed. The next time you see an old piano or a chess set or an antique hairbrush with a smooth white handle, it is worth pausing on. Somewhere behind that shine is a supply chain that stretched across oceans, a labor system built on human suffering, and a species that very nearly disappeared so that comfort could travel a little further from its true cost. Ivory did not just decorate the modern world. In a very real sense, it helped build it, and the bill for that is still, in some corners of the world, being paid. Built fortunes and broke empires, and it's still shaping the world you live in. If that surprised you, subscribe and tell us in the comments which chapter of Ivory's story hit you the hardest. The Congo, the pianos, or the black market that's still running today.